All right, guys, the one thing I want you guys to just be aware, and you saw me using a lot on that other video, just the different ways that we can get a mesh, right? And we talked a little bit about that, but I use a lot of the extract. And again, it's very straightforward, but if I mask something, let's say you want to make a jacket for this guy, or just a collar or something, like if I were to mask something here, and then hit that extract button, you see it'll start giving me something with with some thickness, and I can kind of change the thickness here. Once I hit accept, it will create another mesh just with that extracted, right? So from here I could easily manipulate this around to get something that looks nice. And you see me doing a lot of that with that first Hellboy sketch, and this is basically the process of doing that. The other thing I do quite a lot is just duplicating the mesh within the same subtool. So instead of clicking duplicate and creating another subtool to move it in place, I'm just going to delete this. If I don't have any subdivisions and I hold control and I move it, it will make a duplicate. So I could create a lot of interesting things with this very quickly. So that's another way to start with something. And then the other thing is just the insert primitives. So say if I wanted to get an eye in here, I'll go in the brush, insert primitives, and I'll do like a sphere, and I click and drag, and it will give me an eye within the same subtool. Again, it didn't create another subtool, it's all in here, but I could easily hide this and then do a split hidden, and it will give me a primitive in the place that I want. And again, that by itself will save me some time. Instead of grabbing a sphere, appending it, moving into place, this will save me some time. So again, this is just a couple different ways to get to a result faster. And when you're sketching, or even when you just sculpting for real, this will save you time. So let's go back to the videos and look, just continue working on the Hellboy, and I'll talk to the process, and I'll show you guys some other different techniques and a little bit more of the sculpting process. All right, so here I just appended a sphere, like what we just saw. I just inserted the sphere, and then I split it into a new mesh, and now we can, start refining a little bit more. Same principle, using the same tools, same brushes, but now I just started subdividing or adding a little bit more topology on this mesh, and I'm just starting refining a little bit more. This is sped up, I think four or five times, because there's so many characters here, we're just going to take us forever. And I do want to talk to you guys as we see something that looks unique. Like here, I started to use a lot more dense standard. I love using dense standard brush for this kind of more fleshy details. So I'm this is still very low res. Again, keep that in mind. I do not want to go high res here, because then I'm going to start getting a lot of artifacts. So keeping it low res, but then start refining a little bit more the muscles, trying to get the anatomy in place, try to get the cuts from the neck, everything using damp standard, and then just smoothing it out, and then getting the proportions a little more refined here. And you see, now is the time that we had the primary shapes on the first video, or we're just trying to get the basic forms. Now we're going on the secondary shapes, secondary forms, where the details are a little bit more refined, there's more information, but we're not going fine detail yet. Again, you do not want to go fine detail until the very last piece of the workflow here. Like once you start adding details and playing with alphas, things are just start getting messy, and you're gonna lose control over the details. For the folds, you saw me using some different brushes. The main one is just clay. If you look at the sleeve and you see some of those sharp edges, clay gives us that nice kind of crisp fold and I use most the clay brush to get those folds in place. You saw me doing some masking too on the base, but we're gonna talk more about clothing with the lobster character. Here I'm gonna start working on his hand, and there's a little bit more of the sci-fi kind of workflow. I'm working on a separate scene just because the other scene was already in pose. I want to use symmetry here, so I'm working on this hand separate, so I'm able to use symmetry. And you saw me just starting with the cylinder, masking, inflating, getting some sharp edges using inflate and masking. Masking, you see me doing here. I use masking a lot, especially for sci-fi, where things needs to be sharp. When I'll mask something, and once I start, using or controlling the mesh with using those masks, everything will become a lot more sharper and easier to clean. You might have to go back and watch this video again if you want to kind of understand all the steps that I'm doing here on this hand, but very straightforward. I'm extracting the geo, putting it in place. This hand has a lot of just primitive shapes. For the fingers, I just made I just grab a piece of that and I masked and rotated around to create like the sections of the finger. But again, very straightforward. I'm using clay and high polish to get those sharp as, a little more crisp. But again, I'm not using anything super fancy here. It's just manipulating the shapes using masks, as you see me doing here. And these are very simple primitives, so it's not super complex. You guys probably understand what I'm doing just by watching it once. But basically, you see me here, I masked, made a mask and then extracted that cylinder like we saw at the beginning, putting it in place. The way I got that little bevel is just, again, masking part of it and scaling down. I could start zero meshing these to get a cleaner edge, but for this, for this specifically, I don't need it to be super clean. So it's just enough just using Dynamesh, using high polish or H polish brush. I use H polish brush a lot for these type of hard surface. But you see me, just worrying about what we actually see at this point. Like even all those lines that I put on the fingers, some of them are very messy. But again, we're not seeing the fingers as much on this for the angle. So I'm working here specifically for the angle that we're gonna see on the final image. If I were to do this for real, I'll probably do the hand open, of course, and it take me a lot more time to get it to look perfect. But again, it's just a matter of time. Honestly, like the techniques, the principle will be the same. Now it's just how much time you spend on it and how refined we get. That's why I've made full-fledged characters for productions for many years, and the process is always the same. It's just how much time you would spend on it. For a character like this, full game character, full ready, you could spend months on it, and that's fine because it does take time. So you saw me carve some of those details with Dam Standard. Again, I use Dam Standard for a lot of those things. You see me also using the slash brush. The slash brush is good for doing cracks, and things are a lot more sharper than you would need with Dam Standard. So you see me using both, but those are the two main brushes that I use for those kind of crack type of details. For accessories in general, same principle of like sometimes I work on a separate scene for like those little pockets. For example, I could just made a new scene for them so I could use symmetry if I wanted to have more control. But in this case, it's just more pick and choose how much time you want to spend on certain things. I'm going fast in this one because again, there's a lot of things and the principle here is the same. Hopefully you guys can understand what I'm doing because it's a lot more of the same, just trying to get all the details represented using Dam Standard, using Move. I'm not really cutting out those little holes on the jacket. Those are just to be represented in there. A lot of the sketches that I've been doing, a lot of the things then later on I'm painting it in Photoshop. This hand I grabbed from my anatomy model that we already modeled before. I try not to do a lot of things. I actually get this question quite a lot if I use base mesh or things like that. I do use base mesh for as much as I can. The problem with using base mesh is that your stuff can start looking the same. But so that's why even when I have the time, I will sculpt something from scratch, and I did for some of the other characters. I did sculpt the hand from scratch because the hand is so unique. Like Ape Sapiens have that kind of unique hand that I made from scratch. So I'll show you guys some of the process of doing that from scratch. But that hand came from the anatomy model from the other class that I had, so you guys can find online. Same thing here for that necklace. I'm just duplicating the spheres around, and I show the technique early in the video where I just hold control, drag, and you duplicate the object around, so I don't have to start appending new balls or duplicate something from like a string or something like that. It's just much easier to just Dynamesh it, duplicate it, control drag, all that stuff. Here for the cross, I'm using, now in the center of the scene or new scene, just so I can use symmetry, and I'm just using Dynamesh, pulling the shapes around, getting it in place, and then I'm importing it into the other scene so I can get it in place, getting the thickness to be correct, and then putting in place. And then easy enough, then I have that file saved separate if I wanted to go back and do another version of that cross, or if I want to kind of just make changes, I can go back into the other file instead of making changes on this one, because once it's in position like that, it's going to be very hard to make those adjustments. So, and that I get that question quite a lot about posing in general and how destructive it is to your sculpt. And honestly, there's not a lot of secrets to that. You have to be mindful of keeping files saved separately if you have to, because if you want to go back and make adjustments, you have that, because once it's in a different pose or different type of scene, it will destroy your neutral pose, and you have to re-sculpt. But again, that's why being flexible about the way you approach certain things is important, because going around posing, there's not a lot going around that. It's just you have to do it, and that's that. Like, you have to then start fixing. You have to be flexible enough to re-sculpt things if you have to, and all that stuff. So just be mindful about that and how do you work here. Again, just duplicate that patch around, and I'm just drawing very quickly. This is not going to be the final thing. I'm going to redraw that later on, but I'm just trying to get things represented. So now I'm starting to break the pose a little bit more. I'm rotating, Hellboy's head, so it has a little, break the symmetry, and it's a little more natural. But again, now I'm just making the choice of going and start working without symmetry, specifically on the head. You can use the posable symmetry, but it's kind of funky the way it operates. So I do, once I'm confident that I'm not going to change major proportions, I save that file. Of course, I'm going to start working with a new file. But I do put the character in the pose, and then I start refining it without symmetry. It's the same thing for the body here. I'm starting to go in now and adding those secondary details and breaking it up enough that I have to work without symmetry. And now is the perfect time to put the character in the pose, especially if you're working for statues or collectibles and things like that. Just put the character in the pose and start refining with that. Then if you have to make major changes on the forms, you either can, once you start doing this, just make the pose on a layer, because then you can turn that layer on and off. I've done that a lot of times. I didn't do it in here because this is just more of a kind of a free-form sketch, and there's no real feedback being given by a director or a company or anything like that. But if this were to be a project, like a professional project, I would have layers, and I would put that pose in a layer that if I wanted to then go back and not lose a lot of the information I'm going to start putting now in the character, I just go back and turn that layer off, and it's easy enough that I can then turn it back on or create another layer, make changes, and don't lose a lot of the details. So a lot of things that I'm doing here is with clay, and now clay again is a very sharp. You can get a very sharp edge, and just by using that, I can get those like nice cracks in the shape. Same thing on the hands here. I want to start looking into how the spec is behaving. That's one of the most important things once you start refining your mesh. Look at how the specular and look at how it behaves. If you start getting a lot of those kind of chamfer and bevel edges that the spec is catching the light, that's kind of what you want, and it's going to make it a lot more interesting later on. Once you start rendering this out and making it into a final image, it makes it a lot nicer when you start getting those chamfer and you start paying attention how the specular is behaving. Now I'm just coming, again, damp standard, adding more information, coming in. Again, I could have done this when we first started working on the hand, but you saw me like I took a pause, I went and working all over the character, and now I'm coming back and adding those details. Same thing for the fabric here, for the leather. And this is more of a thicker leather, so I'm keeping that in consideration the way I'm sculpting these folds. The folds needs to be thicker. The way it kind of like folds within itself, there's not a lot of overlaps within the folds because it's a thicker, heavy leather. But I'm coming back, redrawing that patch a little bit better. Very straightforward. But I'm gonna go back into the fabric too and make those folds a little more sharper. Same thing here on this bracelet. I want to go back and add some more planarity to that so the spec behaves a little bit nicer. Quickly dragging some folds into the tail. And I'm not spending a lot of time. Even here it's like sped up, but this video, took me about an hour and a half just to get it to final, because I'm going in quickly, just dropping some information. I could easily go back and start refining this, if this model was approved or something like that, or if I wanted more information. Like this part is a lot more technical and then time consuming of just going back and adding as much detail as you possibly can. But I'm not doing that for this. I'm coming in and throwing as quickly, but again, intentionally putting details where it matters. Like I'm not spending a lot of time thinking about, I'm gonna find a reference for this. And I've done this enough where I know what kind of works for certain things. So it's a little bit more straightforward for me creatively to be kind of creating on the fly, but then still keeping it kind of consistent on the quality and kind of understand where I need to put folds and where I need to put details so it looks convincing. So we will go back into this and we will start adding alphas. We will add a lot more information into the character to like finalize it. But again, I do not want to do this until the end. So we can just literally in the last 10 minutes go back and take this to final. So let's just keep moving to other characters and then we'll go back to this later.